Welcome to today's Torah study, everybody. Today we will be discussing returning artwork that was stolen in the Holocaust. There's a movie out now about it, I believe, called Monuments Men. So that's obviously not from a Torah perspective, but it's a question of, when countries invade other countries and they take their artwork and they take their precious artifacts, after the wars ended and all that, about returning it. So obviously, this is a little bit in theory, not so practical, because they're not asking the Jewish Torah opinion. Although one can make the case, and I'm not a lawyer, that's you guys' job, but one can make the case that the halacha should be consulted, because at the end of the day, when the Nazis confiscated the place where the stuff was stolen was under the rule of Nazi Germany. Let's say in Germany. So usually when something is stolen from a certain location, even though they want to be sold in America, I believe it's correct that you go by the laws of the place where it was stolen. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But the problem is you can't go by Nazi law, because that would be sort of defeat the purpose. So then what law should you follow when you're following the laws of this stolen property? And especially when it was stolen from Jews, so that is a question that maybe you should follow the Jewish law. But obviously no one's going to take that suggestion seriously. But as a point, it's a good idea. We're going to discuss the concept a little bit that come up. I just wanted to publicly thank Beth. We have a new set of books Hebrew books that that the library just acquired, which helped me greatly, and Beth was very helpful in getting these books. I wanted to thank her. So just go through the sources. It's actually also relevant, if you take a look at the first two sources, they're not Torah sources, that in Iraq we have the same problem. In Iraq, Saddam at one point had confiscated a lot of Jewish artifacts. He was a dictator, a ruler, and Saddam Hussein had gone into shuls and synagogues and confiscated and taken a lot of property. Not artwork, but important Judaica, important Hebraico, important books. And when the United States entered Iraq, they actually brought some of it to America because it got waterlogged. And this is the story, and they restored it. But the Iraqis claimed it as their own; it's their national heritage. So should it be returned to Iraq? At one point, it was only Iraqi because Saddam Hussein had stolen it from the Jewish synagogues of Iraq. So whose was it? Was it Saddam Hussein's and therefore the Iraqi people? Was it the Iraqi Jews? If some Jewish descendant who's now living in Israel or America says, that's my family, which people have said, look, that's our family's book, which was confiscated. Whose belongs to it? So these are interesting questions that I'd like to just talk about the Torah perspective today. It won't take too long, and I think it's a little bit interesting. So we're going to start backwards. We're going to start on the assumption that it was stolen. And what do you do with stolen property, and how do you return it? We're then going to go back and discuss perhaps it wasn't stolen at all. Perhaps it doesn't have the status of being stolen, and therefore the rules of returning stolen property wouldn't apply. But let's start on the assumption that it was stolen. So there's a famous passage in Leviticus, which I underlined here, from chapter 5, verse 23. And it shall be when he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall return the article which he has robbed, or the funds which he had withheld, or the item which had been deposited with him, etc., etc. So when you steal, which you shouldn't do obviously, or withhold funds, or anything of that nature monetarily, it's not just a monetary sin. Because the person who steals also has to go to atone for it to sin. When you sin, you're not only sinning to the person you're stealing from, you're sinning to God. So therefore you have to go bring a guilt offering to the Lord, a ram, and you should get an atonement. In other words, here the Torah is telling us that it's much more than just you were not nice to the person you stole from, returned what you stole, and therefore everything will be great. You actually committed a sin. When you commit a sin, you have to atone for that sin. So returning the article is a twofold action. One hand, you return the thing you stolen, but also you're atoning for the sin. So this makes the question important. Because not only when you're dealing with stolen items, you could say, okay, no one cares anymore, and everyone's dead, which is normally the case, so there's no one to return to. But if the point being is that you want to return it because you want to atone for sin, then there's a quest that you still want to atone, irrelevant of the actual person you stole from alive. That's why in Judaism or the Torah, there's a very big difference from secular law. Secular law usually places the statute of limitations. That after a certain amount of time, you acquire title, even though it might be stolen goods, because the statute of limitations has expired. The Torah doesn't recognize that statute of limitations. The probable reason that the Torah doesn't recognize the statute of limitations is because that you're trying to atone for sin. You're trying to rectify a wrong. So there's no statute of limitations for sin. A sin doesn't, after 30 years, doesn't all become a mitzvah. It doesn't happen. So therefore, if it would just be that you took someone's stuff and you're not allowed to have it, so after a certain amount of time, you're allowed to have it. But if it's a sin, obviously that doesn't happen. So that's why a lot of the court cases, and in California, they keep passing or try to pass laws that for Nazi-related artwork, there is no statute of limitations. Because otherwise, the statute of limitations has already expired, and therefore there is no claim on the artwork. So they try to make an exception. But in Torah law, that would be the opposite. There would be no statute of limitations. Okay, so this is basically the main source in the Torah that you have that returning a stolen object is a positive commandment. Now, there's an interesting. So normally, if you're a good robber, you stole from. Or even if you're a professional robber, you steal from a lot of people, but you know who you took stuff from. So then you pay back eventually. If you want to rectify the sin, you pay it back. There's an interesting paragraph on page 2, an interesting passage in the Babylonian Talmud in Beitz of 29a. That what happens if you rob and you don't know who you robbed? Now, the case of the Talmud is of what in those days tax collection worked. That a person, the king said, okay, this year I need 10,000 golden coins. So what did he do? He didn't go, it wasn't like today that everyone paid a percentage or a head tax. What people then did was that he went to the tax collector, and the tax collector was a business. And he said, okay, I need 10,000 golden coins. So the tax collector gave the king 10,000 golden coins, and then what he would do is he would now go, he has the right to collect that from the subjects of the king or the ruler. Now it's up to he could choose how to collect it. The king didn't care. The king wanted his money. He got it, and he got it. He went to one person, he sold the taxes, that person paid all the taxes, and then he went and collected from all the individuals. It was the same thing with tolls. Tolls were not like today you pay $13 to cross to Verrazano, right? Something like that. It wasn't like that. Basically, the guy bought the river from the king. The king said, okay, I want X amount for the river, and now you can collect tolls. And he would obviously, the guy usually was bought by people who were unscrupulous, and they would, they see a rich guy coming in a Mercedes, they would charge a little more. If they see a jalopy coming, they would charge a little less. Same thing with taxes. So you had unscrupulous tax and toll collectors, so he would steal. So what happened was he made money on the deal. If you have to lay out January 1st 10,000 golden coins to the ruler, so you got to you don't lay out 10,000 golden coins for nothing. So he's gonna go collect from everyone 12,000 golden coins. He's not gonna just get 10,000 golden coins. That's not purposeful. So what happened was that's considered a form of robbery. And as you took, or especially if you went to the Jews, you took more from them, or you went to the people you didn't like and you took more from them. Right? Again, you had the power of the king behind you, so that was considered a form of robbery from the general populace. So let's say one of these tax collectors all of a sudden had a change of heart, who wanted to be a good person, but he took from everybody. And he doesn't remember how much he took from everyone. He wants to return, and he wants to do tshuva. And as he wants to follow that verse in Leviticus that says it's a positive commandment, and he wants to rectify his sins. So what does he do? So the Talmud tells us of Hizdah, wells, ditches, and grottos, which is a way of saying, we call that in English, infrastructure. In other words, take the money that you think you got illegally and build in public infrastructure, public works, And that way you will benefit the people you were robbed. Rashi. So now I couldn't find the rest of the sources in English, so I summarized A, B, C, and D, and 4 different rabbis. Rashi being from the 1040 to 1105. The other 3, 19th and 20th century rabbis, discussing what type of restitution when you don't know who you stole from. So Rashi says you want to benefit the people who were robbed. So you build public infrastructure. That way the people who lost now gained. So in a way, you benefited them. Now obviously it's not commensurate to what you stole from them, but nevertheless, for the stealing, the amount of money you don't get. But for the mitzvah, for the positive commandment to rectify the sin, when you gave something back to them, which is the only thing you could do because you don't know how much you stole, then you have fulfilled that commandment. Yeah.
Let's say, what if people left that city or that country?
Exactly. That's number 6. We'll get there in a second. One of the main commentaries to the codes, to the Shulchan Aruch, makes that point. That this is, in other words, here, what's your other choice? So the question is, if you did this and then someone came to you with a claim, would you then have to pay that person back? In other words, is this a good form of repayment, or is this just a way to fulfill the positive commandment to return, but on the other hand, you haven't paid that guy back? So in other words, it's a half atonement, or it's a little bit of doing a mitzvah, but you really haven't paid the guy back. That's what number 6. And since you asked it, one of the main commentators of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of law, says that it's not a really good act of returning because A, it's still in doubt if the guy will use it, and B, as you said, it might not work. It could be you stole from 10 people, and that guy will never use your well that you dug to provide water for everyone. You never know. Okay. What's interesting, if you go back to 5b, the Aruch HaShulchan, who was a rabbi at the turn of from the 1800s to 1900s, turn of the 20th century, he says a very religious idea here. He said that if you try your hardest to return, God will make it that the victim will benefit. That means if you have pure intentions and that you really want to rectify the sin by giving back to the people you took from, so you're right. I build a well. In those days, you build a well. That's people had water. People on the road could have water. So it could be that random people will get water. But he says God will see your pure heart and will cause it that the people who need the water will be the people who you need to pay back, and that way, in some way, you've benefited them. The Chavetz Chaim, the saintly rabbi, also at the turn of the 20th century said, even though the Talmud says, well, ditches and grottos, you can do any public good, including holy books. And especially in those days when printing was expensive and books were scarce, if you would buy books for the public, put them in a synagogue, put them in a place of study, that would also be a way of benefiting the public. Now what's interesting is that Rabbi Feinstein, who died in 1986, whose yahrzeit, the day he died, was this past Saturday, 13th of Adar, he said a very interesting thing. Today we're very big into plaques and fanfare. That means if you donate a law school, you get a name on it. And if you donate an elevator, you get a plaque in the elevator. Or if you donate a book, you should, and we should. It's the right thing to do. That if someone does a mitzvah and wants to donate of his own good heart, he should be recognized, or he or she should be recognized for their. That's why I wanted to thank Beth again for the svarim, for the books in the library. But Rabbi Feinstein says, if you're building public works as an act of atonement, so that you can't get honor from it, you can't get reward from it, because that would be the antithesis of what we're trying to do. You're trying to say, listen, to yourself, to God, I'm sorry, I want to return. So now, are you going to actually go get an award or a plaque for actually just because you're not a bad guy? No. So Rafaiti says that if you're going to do this and you're going to build public works, make sure that you don't get any honor or fanfare based on that. Okay, so applying what we learned, the question that many organizations deal with is that most of the victims of the Nazi Holocaust no longer are around. Either they were killed by the Nazis, or today it's been 60, 70 years since it's 60 years or 65 years since the Holocaust even ended. So what do you do? What do you do with there's very few victims left, and there's no one to give it to. So can you apply this ruling and let's say give the money toward Jewish institutions or to some way rectify? So that's part of the question, how to understand this concept that the Talmud tells us that you do something for public good? Is the public good based on your trying to do something good with the money, or is it a question of that you actually in some way benefiting the victims? Here, there's no way to actually benefit the victims, so the question is, would there be purpose to that? So this is very a lot of the Jewish organizations which did get restitution for the artwork, the question is, or from the sale of artwork. There was a famous case in the 80s that it was called a Sotheby sale. That Sotheby sold a lot of Judaica, which turned out to have been someone personally took it out of a shul, the Reform University, the Reform Rabbinical Seminary. So the question was, can he sell it? And if they sell it, what should you do with the money? Could you buy rare books? Could you give it to libraries? So that is a valid question that many organizations deal with. But I had said at the beginning, that was all under the assumption that it was stolen goods. So there's actually an interesting case to be made. And this is one of the rare cases that the rabbis, where you had a conqueror, ruler, the Nazi Germany, which after 10-something years was gone. Right? All of Nazi Germany lasted, 10, 15 years. The Nuremberg law started in the early 30s, and in 45 Germany was gone. So the whole period of their conquest and of their ruling was 12 years, 13 years, 14 years. The point being is, we have a concept, that's what we're talking about now, we have a concept that a conquering nation does acquire the rights to the nation it conquers. Now, it's not so politically correct today, but no one's really seriously giving back Manhattan Island to the Native Americans. And there is a concept that when you go into a land and you conquer it, in those days when one king was the ruler and another king beat that king in warfare, he now was the king of that town. And now he legally collects the taxes. These are legally his subjects, do whatever he wants with them. So there is this concept called conquering. If you take a look at source number 1 under conquer, in the Babylonian Talmud and Gittin, Rav Papa said the territory of Ammon and Moab became purified through the occupation of Sichon. God forbade the Jews to, when they were entering the land of Israel, God forbade the Jews to take the land of Ammon and Moab. Ammon and Moab were considered cousins, or that's Edom. I'm sorry. Ammon and Moab were from Lot, which was a nephew of Abraham. So God said, you may not take their territory. So the Jews had to go around it. But what happened was previously there was a king called Sichon. Sichon he waged war against Ammon and Moab. He took some of their land, and now the Jewish people can take the land because it was purified, meaning it was in the interim conquered by Sichon, and therefore it wasn't considered Ammon's land, it was considered Sichon's land. So there's a concept that, from here we learn the concept that you can acquire by conquering. So the question here is, the rabbis discuss, is that like a form of, is it like legal stealing? That if you're a king and you steal, and that now, but it becomes yours? Or is it that there's a new form of thing called conquest? Now, what do I say by legal stealing? There's a concept in the Torah which you don't find in mostly law. When you steal something in secular law, if it's still around, it has to be returned to the owner. If there's a good faith sale, that is a question. But in Judaism, the Torah has another level. It's called Yiyush. Yiyush is giving up, or giving up hope. If the person who was stolen from always hoped to get it back, then no matter what, it remains his or hers. If the person gave up hope, that means that I'm never going to get it back, then you lost claim to get it back once it was passed on, once it was sold, once it was given over. So there's actually that added detail whether or not it was given up on. We call that in Hebrew Yiyush. So the question is, when one king conquers another king, does he acquire through this process that everyone gave up because now he's the new king? So they all, in a way, agreed he's the new king and that's why he's the new king? Or is conquering a valid method of acquiring something? So what's interesting is, and this the rabbis dealt with for the first time in the 1950s, what happens when a conquering nation conquers and then goes out of business 15 years later? do you say their conquest was a real conquest? And therefore it actually, as unpolitically correct as it is, when the Nazis, who were a conquering power, acquired something, it became theirs. Just like when Rome conquered Judea and they acquired all the slaves, they were actually slaves. Why were they slaves? Because Rome was the conquering power, and the slaves, they acquired the slaves. So as unpolitically correct as it is, perhaps Nazi Germany, by fact that they conquered, therefore actually took actual possession and title of all these things, and it now became theirs. So the rabbis, yeah?
Does this concept apply to conquering land, like as a result of war? Or does it also, because we're talking about possessions.
It goes both. It goes about people, it goes about possessions, it goes about land, it goes all those things. That's the Talmud recognizes a valid form of acquisition, all forms of conquest. But again, conquest is obviously limited to a nation or a king. When I steal your book, it's not conquest, that's stealing.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because although Nazi Germany no longer exists, the descendants of the Nazis still exist.
Right, so actually the case that was just found out in November, but it's a really 3-year-old case, was the son of the actual, some of the 1,200 pieces of artwork? Take a look here at page 1. 1,280 paintings this past November were found in Munich, in one guy's apartment. Okay, the person who lived in that apartment was 81 years old. He was the actual son of the art collector who even though he was a quarter Jewish, he was approved by the Nazis, and he took all the artwork. So it's an actual descendant, son, of the actual person who had stolen it and conquered it in the name of Nazi Germany. So here it's actually what you meant to say. In other words, he's obviously, Nazi Germany has no power anymore, but did his father legally acquire it by this concept of conquering, and therefore it is actually his, and you can't take it from him? Or do you say no? And this is what the rabbis discussed. There's a famous case. There was a Torah crown, a silver crown they put on a Torah scroll that was taken and eventually made its way to a museum. And one day a guy walks into the museum and says, "Hey, I know that. That's mine." And he could prove it. He had witnesses, because on Torah scroll, when you donated the crown to a Torah scroll, you etch your name into the silver. Reuven ben Shimon and his family donated this crown. So he said, "Look, that's my name." And then he found someone who lied from the town and said, "Yeah, I remember." So the question was, he wanted his Torah crown back to the Torah scroll, and the museum didn't want to give it back. And they went to the religious courts in Israel and debated this question, whether or not he lost it. Once it was conquered and taken by the Nazis, perhaps it's too late. Perhaps that it was already, it's not yours, you lost it. It's unfortunate, it's not right, and we feel bad. But on the other hand, the other case was made is that their conquest, it's only as long as they're still the conquering nation. And the concept of acquiring through conquest only is as long as you're still in charge. So that's the question the rabbis debated in the 1950s, based on this question. And that's the paragraph here. Now I just want to bring up the third and last thing is this concept of yish, this concept of giving up. So you take a look here, it actually is based on returning a lost object. In the Torah's idea is that if you lost an object, either because you lost it or was stolen, if it turns out that you gave up on it, then you lost claim to it. So that's what it brings here. It's, even though it's not clear in the verse in Deuteronomy in chapter 22, it says, am I looking here? Yeah, it says, if your brother's ox or sheep went lost, you should return it to him. And it says you should do that with his donkey, his garment, all lost articles of your brother which he has lost and you have found. So the Talmud in Bav Metzia says it only applies to something which is lost and can be found. That means anything which has some identifying marks on it, you have a right to claim because you didn't give up on it. But anything which you give up on because you know you'll never be able to claim it, you lost all rights to claim it. Even though right now it's found. A day later it's found. So for example, one of the main examples that the Gemara, the Talmud gives, is something called Zuto Shel Yam, which is basically a tidal wave. A tidal wave doesn't mean like a tidal wave. It means like when the tide comes in and just takes away stuff, and then it drags it back out to sea. So the Talmud says you have no hope of ever getting it back. So you actually lose possession, and it's not a lost object, and no one has the positive mitzvah commandment to return it to you. So therefore, only something which can be returned to you, you have hope of having it returned, that's the object you have a claim on. So the same thing goes with something stolen. If it's stolen in a way that you actually that you actually believe that you'll one day have a claim to get it back, then you don't give up on it, you don't lose possession. But something which you give up immediately, you'll never get it back, then you lost claim. And even if you find it, you have no more claim to it because you lost possession by giving up on it. So it's a big debate amongst the rabbis, and I guess psychologists as well, how to understand the mindset of the people who were of the victims of Nazi Germany. Did they give up? Now, again, hindsight is very hard, because let's say a lot of my grandparents are from Hungary. In Hungary, till 1944, Nazi Germany did not invade. And they didn't really believe anything bad was going to happen. There was no, media like there is today. There was no spreading of the word. Most people in Hungary thought, the war's going on, it's bad, but they had no idea to the extent. So when they marched in and took their stuff, perhaps they thought, okay, we'll get it back one day. Right now, it's not so good. Eventually, something will happen. They didn't know what we know today. In fact, I had my great aunts and uncles. From Romania, they dug a ditch in their backyard, lined it with metal, put everything in, covered it up, and those who survived after the war went to get it. So you see that there was definitely a mindset of people that we'll survive this, whoever will survive, and we're not going to lose our stuff. On the other hand, you can definitely make a case that people realize that, especially the people who were killed, realize that they're not getting anything back. Their lives, their possessions were meaningless, and they gave up hope. So the same question would apply. How do you view all the stuff? Yes, it might be stolen, and yes, it might not be conquered, but perhaps the owners had given up on it, and therefore lost claim to it. So that was a three-pronged attack. That on one hand, perhaps even if it's stolen, how do you return it? Perhaps the Nazis actually acquired through conquering, and therefore you can't demand it back according to the Torah law. And perhaps even if it was stolen, but we or the victims had given up on it, and therefore they lost claim to it. But that is where I brought on the bottom here of page 3, that in the codes, it was assumed sometime in the 15th and 16th century, that it was assumed that we made a enactment that even though technically, if you give up on it, you lost possession and you lost title, nevertheless, one should act, and if you recognize the owner, one should act lifnim mishurat adin, within the lines of the actual judgment. That means even though the actual law might dictate that you lost title and possession by giving up on it, nevertheless, the finder or the person who stole it should give it back to act in a proper way. So this is a big debate. What is the logic of that, and can we apply that today? In other words, how far this enactment, this rabbinic enactment from the 15th and 16th centuries, how far did it go? Did it go to the point where you actually had to return it under all circumstances? Can it be enforced? Can it be enforced by the court that you have to be a righteous person and you have to give it back? Or it's a righteous idea that even though the person lost title, you should return it, but we can't enforce it, and therefore if a person decides that I'm not going to be a good person, I'm not going to return it, therefore you can't enforce it. So this is the general question I just thought was interesting regarding the looted artwork. So just to sum up, it's a question how to view it. Is it viewed as stolen? Is it viewed as lost, or is it viewed as conquered? If it is viewed as conquered, it's gone. If it's viewed as lost, it depends on the psychological outlook of the victims. And if it was stolen when it should be returned, the question then is how to return it. And we saw the Talmud, which says you're supposed to do public works or infrastructure. And the question is, how to do that today? Because one of the concepts is that the victim, that's so much of benefit, which they don't, the victims are no longer around, how would one go ahead about and do that? Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
This might not actually deal with the Holocaust, but I always think about the ancient art of antiquity, like when the British Museum holds ancient pieces of ancient Egyptian that is part of the natural heritage of Egypt. How does that work? I mean, these people, they weren't conquered, but
That's a good question. Like India and Egypt, where they colonized. I don't. That would be a good question, I guess, for international law also. But I understand colonization is a form of conquest. So then, as unpolitically correct or as unnice as it sounds, they would have a right to keep those possessions. Now, when they gave independence back, which was a voluntary thing in a way, when let's say the British Empire gave independence to India, were they giving independence like we made a mistake, or like, hey, from now on you're independent, but all the stuff we took when we were the power are ours? And again, I'm not saying it's a nice thing, and I don't think it's the right thing, but I'm saying just from the legal standpoint, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that you mentioned that different opinions said that if something is stolen, then one should try to give back to a public situation. So let's say in the Nazi example, the Nazis stole a lot of things from the Jews, and they're not sure what they stole or who they were. Like, so I'm just trying to understand on a contemporary basis, like if that happened in today's day and age, like how do you give to a public?
Right, so that's
because you're not sure who it is and where they're from.
so that's exactly I was talking to someone who worked in the World Jewish Congress and who was in the reparations committee. That's a good question. That's what they grapple with all the time. In other words, obviously, if you have still victims of the Holocaust and you know, and you give them money, that's one thing. But now you have all this money, the Claims Conference. This again, I'm taking it from a personal standpoint. My great uncle said to me many times that his brother, who had died in the Holocaust, went to Switzerland before the war, put money in the bank. Now, no one knows what name he used. No one knows the number. There's no tracing of it, and they're not. So we have no idea. Yeah. But we do know. We have testimony, at least from a person, hopefully an honest person, my great uncle, that there was money, our money, in his brother's money, in a Swiss bank. So now that the Swiss banks gave out money, a few years ago there was a settlement that they gave out billions of dollars. So they gave it to the public. They didn't give it to the individuals. They didn't, because they felt it was too. We're not going to find every individual, and most of them probably had no living relatives. But on the other hand, what happens when a guy says, "Listen, I know it's my brother, but I have no proof of it"? So that's the problem. So they tried to do is do something that would benefit as many people as possible, whether it was ambulances, whether it was things like that, But again, there's no good. The question is, this is what they grapple with in the reparations committee: how to deal with it.
So does that, if you do the public work, does that satisfy? Like, does that absolve you from the sin?
So absolve, I don't know, but it definitely just like the Talmud says that it does count as a way of
repentance?
the way of repentance. So I don't know if that's why the Swiss banks did it to get repentance, but I'm glad they did it nonetheless.
So, and the public works can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be in Germany or like.
No, it shouldn't be. It should be where the victims will have some benefit from it.
Okay, and even if, let's say, they don't know the victims or where they're from.
Right. So it should be the descendants of the victims, or all the victims who would have a claim on it.
Right.
So in theory, if a Swiss bank knew that all its investors or depositors were from Hungary and Romania, it should look where Hungarian and Romanian descendants were, and don't give it to Jews in Australia if they were known there from Hungary and from Hungary and Romania. Yeah.
Practically, does Jewish law matter in this case?
So that's what I started off with.
I know.
Yeah, probably not.
Okay.
Unless you make a case. There are certain cases when the most famous case was the Sotheby case, where it was a Jew, it wasn't Nazis. It was Jews versus Jews. What happened was there was a man who claimed that the Reform Rabbinical Seminary gave him all their rare books to smuggle out because he was going to America in '39, and he kept it for himself. And there's a Rabbi Bleich from Cardozo Law, who his point was that when it's a disagreement between two Jews and you can't go back to Nazi Germany and use their laws, so by default you should use the Jewish law. But that being said, what many people or advocates of public policy have said is, at the end of the day, there is no one's arguing law or not law. We're arguing what's the right thing to do. So since you're trying to benefit the Jews and you're trying to do the right thing, so shouldn't you at least take into account the Jewish perspective, the Torah perspective, if you're trying to benefit the Jews who you did wrong to? So on a technical level, Jewish law doesn't have a real say. On a moral level, it should have a say. That's why I was speaking about it. Okay?